Welcome to the Rob Seco Field Ready Podcast with your host, Jim Robinson.
Hello, and welcome back to the Rob Seco Field Ready Podcast. I'm your host, Jim Robinson. Today we're going to be talking about sudden death syndrome in soybeans, with the disease cycle, management considerations, as well as different risk factors that may be important to sudden death syndrome. Today we have joining with us Lance Goettsch. Lance, could you go ahead and introduce yourself?
Yeah. Hi, my name is Lance Goettsch. I am the product evaluation lead for Rob Seco, and I cover all of Iowa and Illinois.
Excellent. Now, Lance, where do you live?
I live in eastern Iowa, north of Davenport, in a small town called Kelm.
Yeah, so you're in an area that has an awful lot of sudden death syndrome in soybeans. Can you tell us a little bit about the disease and where you find it?
Yeah, so sudden death is a soil-borne fungal organism, and it's found in most of the states where soybeans are grown, or most of the Midwest. And it can cause pretty severe, and up to 50% in most cases.
Yeah, so yield losses up to and sometimes exceeding 50% for those most susceptible fields and varieties. That's a pretty substantial yield loss. What is it? Can you tell us a little bit about the disease cycle of sudden death syndrome? Where does it start, and how does it infect, and what does it do over the winter?
Yeah, so the inoculum will survive in soybean residue, and it will eventually infect the seedling just between germination or just after crop emergence. And then after the seedling is infected, it will eventually create a toxin that is translocated up through the stem and up to the canopy, eventually causing premature leaf loss, which will greatly affect yield.
Yeah, so basically if it survives in the soil on the crop residue for both soybeans and corn, infecting the seedling, then are there any risk factors that increase the chances of the seedlings getting infected?
Yeah, so planting in cool or wet soils or compacted soils usually can lead to a more susceptible situation. Also, if that field is known to have soybean cyst nematodes, you're at risk for increased presence of sudden death.
Now, how would soybean cyst nematodes increase the risk of developing sudden death syndrome?
Yeah, so soybean cyst nematodes are basically very tiny worms, and they will chew on and insert themselves inside of soybean roots. And because of this damage, you're causing an opening that allows sudden death to get in and infect the soybean plant. So
with that, if sudden death syndrome is infecting the roots of the plant, what are the different symptoms, the ways to identify, and how does sudden death syndrome cause yield loss within soybeans?
So identification usually happens mid-season, usually around flowering. At that time, you'll start to see some yellow spots in a mosaic pattern in the upper canopy of the soybean. But after you see some of this, you'll eventually see some interveinal chlorosis and necrosis and leaf drop, premature leaf drop. But to determine whether or not it's actually sudden death syndrome and not another disease like brown stem rot or stem canker, we'd recommend that you split the stem in half and look for the pith in the middle. The pith will be white, but just outside that pith, you'll find the cortical cells. And if those cortical cells are a grayish, brownish color, you're likely looking at sudden death. And then one additional step you could do is to dig a little deeper and look at the taproot. If you find that the taproot have a blue coloration around the outer surface, those are the fungal colonies of sudden death. So all those ways will help you identify sudden death.
Yeah, now, you said that the foliar symptoms, so the interveinal chlorosis in the infected beans, can be an indicator of sudden death syndrome, but can also be an indicator of other diseases. So splitting the stem is required to actually fully confirm that you have sudden death syndrome. What are some of the other diseases that may cause similar foliar symptoms?
Yeah, so the other diseases would be brown stem rot or stem canker. And then the reason why sudden death can cause such a large yield loss is the fact that you're infecting the roots, so you're reducing the amount of nutrients and water uptake. And then also because the leaves are infected, you're having lower photosynthesis. And then because of that lower amount of photosynthesis, you're causing flower abortion, or you're going to be developing pods that are going to have smaller soybeans. And this results in the yield losses of 50% or more.
Now, this all sounds, pretty serious in that there's not necessarily anything you can do once you're identifying the symptoms in the field. But what are some of the things that a farmer can do to manage their risks with sudden death syndrome?
Yeah, so like you said, sudden death cannot be eradicated from a field, but it can be managed with a combination of various practices. So the two practices I would recommend to start with would to be to look at planting date. So if you have a field that has a history of sudden death, I would recommend pushing the planting date back a little further and then combine the next management practice, which would be variety selection. Select a variety that has a tolerance to sudden death. So those two combinations would be my first choice. The planting date being pushed back allows for warmer soils and hopefully drier soils.
Now, with the drier soils component being such a significant factor in the development and infection of sudden death syndrome, if we're looking at a field with poor drainage or versus a well-drained field, obviously you may still want to plant your soybeans early, and so you may actually go in and plant the well-drained field first, waiting a couple days, or at least until there's a good outlook with the poorly drained field. With field selection, there's also a component, as you mentioned earlier, where the presence and quantity of cyst nematode can impact the amount of sudden death seen in the field. How might that factor into field selection for managing sudden death syndrome?
Yeah, so I would definitely, any fields that have soybean cyst nematode, I would definitely consider adding nematicide to your soybean seed treatment. Other seed treatments I would recommend would be Saltro or Levo. Those have worked really well to help control sudden death. And then I would also include an insecticide. If you are able to prevent any damage to the plant, you're reducing the risk of sudden death entering the plant. And then the last two things I'd recommend, we're talking about water management. If you do have some wet fields and a sudden death is an issue there, I would recommend considering adding additional tile in those sections of the field to move that water away, which will help reduce the risk for SDS infection. And if it's a smaller problem, you could consider some tillage practices. Tilling will help open up the field and dry it out and warm it up a little bit a lot quicker.
Yeah, so basically all of these things collectively, what happens between the seed treatment, field selection, tillage practices, drainage practices, effectively what that's doing is promoting conditions wherein the plant may be able to grow more quickly, have better sustained growth, and thus making the seedling a less favorable host for fusarium. So if you can find anything that you can do that may enhance or improve the growing conditions for the plant, you actually reduce the chances of infection, or at least the severity of the infection. Now, as you mentioned before, variety selection plays a really big role in the management of sudden death syndrome. Can you tell us a little bit about the range and susceptibility of different varieties for sudden death syndrome?
So we rate our soybeans in our soybean product guide based on a 1 to 9 scale, 9 being very tolerant to sudden death syndrome, and anything that's 5 or below is something that would be more susceptible. So I would definitely consider a product that has 6 or above, moving closer towards a 9 if you have severe sudden death in that field.
So Lance, is there any effect of rotation on the chances of getting sudden death syndrome in a field?
Yes, there's been quite a bit of research done on this, and actually sudden death, the inoculum can survive on a rotation of corn and soybeans. It can survive on corn residue and soybean residue. So if you want to effectively reduce the inoculum in the field, you're going to have to do multiple years of corn, or the best way would be to go towards a cereal grain or have alfalfa as a long-term crop in there for a few years to reduce that inoculum in the field.
Absolutely. And so that rotational aspect may actually play into why we see sudden death syndrome being so prevalent in the states that we see it in. Not only is sudden death syndrome prevalent in the states that you typically see a lot of soybeans in, but it's traditionally heavier in those states that have a higher predominance of just a corn and soybean rotation. So states such as Iowa, Illinois, Indiana, Minnesota are all states that tend to have the worst sudden death syndrome predominance, whereas other states such as Nebraska, Wisconsin, the Dakotas, while they may have sudden death syndrome. Tends not to be as severe or as prevalent as you might find in those I states. Excellent. Well, Lance, so far what we talked about today is sudden death syndrome as being a soil-borne fungal organism that's found in most states where soybeans are grown. The disease cycle, where it starts on crop residue and in the soil, infecting seedlings as they're emerging from the soil or shortly thereafter, and then infecting the root system that then can cause foliar symptoms that result in an overall yield loss that can be in excess of 50% in the worst cases. You told us that the best ways to manage sudden death syndrome would be through planting date and field selection, where a later planting date typically ends with warmer soil temperatures, maybe a little bit drier soil conditions, as well as fields that haven't had a history of sudden death syndrome being those fields you may want to plant earlier into. Soybean cyst nematode may also play a role in the infection of sudden death syndrome in the beans. And so by adding a nematicide on a seed treatment, you may actually be able to reduce your risks for sudden death syndrome. As well as variety selection, we have a wide range of tolerances to sudden death syndrome, ranging from very at risk to quite tolerant. So selecting varieties that have a higher tolerance to sudden death syndrome will typically reduce the prevalence of the disease. And finally, there are several seed treatments that work really well to reduce the amount of sudden death syndrome that infects the plant. The best two of these would be Elevo and Saltro, especially in combination with nematicides, other fungicides, and insecticides. And so, Lance, thank you so much for joining us today.
Yeah, thanks, Jim.
With that, be sure to tune in to the Rob Seco Field Ready podcast on the 1st and 15th of every month. And until then, stay field ready.
Thanks for tuning in to this episode of the Rob Seco Field Ready podcast. Join us next time to be field ready.
A Parkville Media Production.